The Economist.
October 2nd to October 8th, 2021.
Word for word, the articles from this week's edition of The Economist, including...
From the Leaders section, the City of London, from Big Bang to a whimper.
From the International section, Conscription, Call Me Maybe.
From the Technology Quarterly section, Future Food, the new Anthropocene diet.
The World This Week. Politics.
After Germany's general election, the Social Democrats, or SPD, emerged as the largest party, overtaking the Christian Democrats and their Bavarian allies, who currently lead the ruling Grand Coalition. But forming a new government will probably take many weeks, as it will almost certainly involve a three-party coalition. Olaf Scholz, the SPD's candidate for Chancellor, is the most probable successor to Angela Merkel at the head of a traffic light coalition, including the Greens and the pro-business Free Democrats, though this is by no means guaranteed. Armin Laschet, who led the Christian Democrats to their worst ever defeat, is facing pressure to resign, but insists he still has a chance to construct his own coalition. Iceland fell short of having Europe's first parliament where women hold most of the seats, following a recount after its election. Women took almost 48% of the seats. The left-right coalition increased its governing majority. An independent investigation claimed that 83 aid workers sexually abused girls and women while responding to an outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Staff from the World Health Organization are among the accused. Fighting between jihadist groups in Nigeria left dozens dead. Islamic State West Africa province is gaining the upper hand over Boko Haram, which has spent a decade kidnapping schoolgirls and strapping bombs to children. The latest fight was over which group gets to tax fishermen. Jihadists from a previously unknown group claimed that they had killed 6 intelligence officers in Sudan. The country's transition to democracy is looking fragile 2 years after the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir, a bloody dictator who ruled for 30 years. Tunisia's president, Kais Saied, suspended parts of the constitution and said he would rule by decree. This comes after a power grab in July when he suspended parliament and seized emergency powers. A judge in Mexico refused to issue arrest warrants for 31 scientists whom the country's attorney general wants to prosecute for mishandling funds. The lack of evidence for the charges and the fact that the law was not in force at the time of the alleged crime has led to accusations that the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador is trying to politicize public life. Haiti's general election was postponed yet again when Ariel Henry, the Prime Minister, removed the council that was to oversee the poll. Mr. Henry, mired in conspiracy theories about the assassination of the country's president in July, says he would like to hold the election next year. Fighting between rival gangs at a prison in Ecuador left 116 inmates dead. At least 10 men were decapitated. The gangs have links to Mexico's drug cartels. Meng Wanzhou, an executive at Huawei, a Chinese tech firm, was allowed to fly home to China from Canada after almost 3 years of fighting extradition to America. Ms. Meng had admitted to misleading bankers about Huawei's links to a company active in Iran. At almost the same time, 2 Canadian prisoners in China, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, were allowed to fly back to Canada. The 2 Michaels are widely thought to have been held as hostages, pending Ms. Meng's release. Power cuts affected about 20 of China's provinces, including many industrial areas. Reasons for the cuts ranged from the high price of coal to efforts by some provinces to meet strict environmental limits on energy consumption. Officials announced that foreign spectators will be barred from the Winter Olympics to be hosted by Beijing in February because of COVID-19. Kishida Fumio will be the next Prime Minister of Japan after the ruling Liberal Democratic Party elected him as its president. The former foreign minister takes over from the increasingly unpopular Suga Yoshihide, who is stepping down amid widespread criticism of the government's handling of the pandemic. Mr. Kishida, who trumped the public favourite Kono Taro, is seen by the party as a safe pair of hands. Manny Pacquiao, a senator in the Philippines and a world champion boxer, announced his retirement from the sport and his intention to run for president. The Philippine constitution limits presidents to a single term, but Rodrigo Duterte, the combative incumbent, will still be on the ticket. He has said he will run for vice president. Appearing before a Senate committee in Washington, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that he and others had urged Joe Biden to retain 2,500 troops in Afghanistan in order to defend Kabul and slow the Taliban's advance. This could have allowed for possible talks, though the general admitted that the outcome might have been the same. Mr. Biden has said he received no such advice ahead of America's speedy withdrawal in August. A study from Oxford University found that the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a drop in life expectancy not seen since the Second World War in Western Europe. Across the 29 rich countries studied, the biggest fall in life expectancy was among American men, who saw a decline of 2.2 years in 2020 relative to 2019. There were 21,570 homicides in America last year, according to the FBI, up by 29% from 2019. The homicide rate rose from 5.1 to 6.5 per 100,000 people. This was still well below its peak of 9.8 in 1991. British motorists endured petrol queues. One cause was a shortage of lorry drivers to deliver the stuff, exacerbated by Brexit, which has made it harder and less attractive for foreign drivers to work in Britain. Another cause was panic buying. Despite government assurances that there was plenty of fuel in depots, drivers flocked to fill their tanks. Other European countries also had fuel supply problems, but Britain's were especially severe.
The World This Week. Business.
Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary, gave her strongest warning yet on the potential consequences of not raising the federal debt limit, saying it would be catastrophic. The Treasury estimates that it will run out of money by October 18th unless the ceiling is increased to allow the government to continue borrowing. Even with a stopgap resolution to avoid a government shutdown, the issue of lifting the debt limit still remains. Ms. Yellen said the uncertainty was eroding investor confidence. Stock markets had their worst day in months on September 28th. The S&P 500 dropped by 2% and the Nasdaq by 2.8%, its biggest decline in half a year. European and Asian bourses also fell. The prospect of a government shutdown was just one factor unsettling investors. Markets are also digesting moves by central banks to taper their stimulus programs, which has led to a sell-off in bonds. Natural gas prices remained volatile but were still rising sharply in Asia and Europe, and to a lesser degree in America. That fed into oil markets as some industries switched to the commodity to keep the lights on. The price of Brent crude crept up to $80 a barrel for the first time in 3 years. Evergrande, China's second biggest property developer, sold part of its stake in a bank to a publicly owned investment group, raising $1.5 billion. The bank has demanded that Evergrande, which has rattled markets by warning of a debt default, use its proceeds to repay a loan. It won't make much of a dent in the company's $300 billion worth of liabilities. Still, the fact that the stake was sold to a state investment firm was taken as a sign that the government is working behind the scenes to avoid Evergrande's collapse. Battle lines were drawn in the American Senate over a possible second term for Jerome Powell as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Elizabeth Warren, a left-wing Democrat, became the first senator publicly to oppose Mr. Powell remaining in office because of his past support for financial deregulation. She called him a dangerous man. Joe Biden is expected to announce his decision on who should lead the central bank within the next few months. Ford announced an $11 billion plan to build 3 factories that will produce batteries for electric vehicles and another plant to make its F-series of electric pickup trucks. The investment is in partnership with SK Innovation, a South Korean company. The car maker is providing $7 billion. Along with its Detroit rivals, General Motors and Stellantis, Ford has made a commitment to switch to greener motoring and wants 40% of its global sales to be electric by 2030. Voters in Berlin backed a referendum proposal to expropriate apartments held by corporate landlords, the most visceral reaction yet in a big European city to property speculation that has priced out most families. The vote is non-binding and may end up in Germany's constitutional court. With one of the toughest vaccine mandates in American business, United Airlines said that 96% of staff in the United States had been jabbed to protect themselves against COVID-19, but that it was preparing to fire almost 600 who had not done so before the deadline of September the 27th. They had a few days leeway to comply. About 2,000 employees sought a religious or medical exemption. In Britain, the furlough scheme introduced at the start of the pandemic in March 2020 came to an end. Over its course, the programme covered 11.6 million workers, paying up to 80% of their wages, though by July 2021 that had dropped to 1.6 million. The government spent nearly £70 billion, that's $94 billion, on its support. Meanwhile, revised figures showed that the British economy grew by 5.5% in the second quarter, a faster pace than an initial estimate had suggested. GDP is now just 3.3% below its pre-pandemic level of late 2019. A leading indicator of house prices in America rose at a record rate for the 4th consecutive month. The S&P Core Logic Case Shiller National Index jumped by 19.7% in July over the same month a year ago, with the biggest increases reported in Phoenix, San Diego and Seattle. The firm said it needed more data to tell if surging prices were being driven by a shift to the suburbs as a result of the pandemic. Dealing in bricks of a different kind, Lego reported a net profit of 3.6 billion Danish kroner, that's $1 billion, for the first half of the year, up by 140% from the same period in 2020. Amazon launched its first robot for the home, which will sell for under $1,000. Astro, an internet-connected roving device, has a periscope camera that its owner can access remotely. In a nod to privacy concerns, it can be programmed to stay out of intimate spaces such as the bedroom or bathroom.
Leaders.
The Economist, October 2nd to October 8th, 2021. In the Leaders section, the City of London, from Big Bang to a whimper. Changing China, Xi's new reality. Japanese politics, second rate, and more.
Leaders.
From Big Bang to a whimper. Britain's stock market is fading away. It can be revived.
Ask Britons what actually goes on in the City of London and you'll be met with a blank stare. Trading the yen and the yuan, structuring derivatives and providing the world's financial plumbing are all money spinners, but they barely register in the public imagination. The exception is the stock market. Daily news bulletins report trading on the FTSE 100 index of leading London shares. Booms and busts are charted by its gyrations. The London Stock Exchange, or LSE, is the stamping ground of giant multinationals, where city slickers and corporate fat cats thrash out huge deals to buy and sell the world's companies. Or at least it used to be. London's high-flying stock market has spent the past decade tumbling back to earth. In 2006, the companies with shares listed in London were worth 10.4% of the global equity market. Today, that figure is 3.6%. London has lagged even behind the laggards. Its share of Europe's total market value has declined from 36% to 22% over the same period. The denizens of the LSE that are left look geriatric. Less than 1/50th of the FTSE 100's value comes from tech companies, compared with almost 40% of the S&P 500 index of American firms. James Anderson of Baillie Gifford, one of the most successful global investors of the era, recently told the Financial Times that Britain has a 19th century stock market. He is right. One reason for Britain's abysmal bourse is the underperformance of large British firms. Too many, from BP to GSK to HSBC and Tesco, average age 169, have dropped from the top tier of their industries owing to the chronic British disease of poor management. That has dragged down returns and made some firms vulnerable to takeovers. The entire asset management industry, which has the job of supervising other firms, is badly run. Britain's most valuable fund manager is now worth less than 10% of America's largest. British pension schemes have spent years loading up on bonds and selling shares in a myopic quest to eliminate risk. They now have too little exposure to economic growth or wealth creation. The city has also suffered as global firms with international capital-raising options have drifted off. London's revival after the Big Bang, reforms in 1986 that deregulated trading, relied in part on the stock exchange becoming a venue for mobile global businesses. Recent weeks have seen Prudential, an insurance giant, choose a share offering in Hong Kong, and BHP, one of the largest London-listed companies, announced plans to have its sole primary listing in Australia. London's aspirations to be a hub for European businesses have been dealt a blow by Brexit. The city's final weakness is a dearth of start-ups that choose to list in London. In 2005, London hosted 1/5 of the world's initial public offerings, or IPOs. Today, it hosts 1/25. A stock exchange that continually fails to attract exciting new firms will come to resemble a museum. It is reasonable to ask how much a puny stock market matters. For British savers, the answer is that it doesn't much. They can, should, and increasingly are ditching their home bias and building global portfolios. As owners of superior foreign shares, they may feel nostalgia for their once great home market, but that is all. For Britain's economy, a shrivelled stock market matters more. It limits the options start-up founders have to expand their firms. Britain's universities, courts and venture capital scene make it a good place to build a business regardless, but the country's attractions are fading. For the city, the stock market matters a great deal. London remains a dominant centre for trading debt, derivatives and currencies, but equities are a crucial part of any claim to be a global financial centre. Listed firms exert a pull on other financial activities and on the accounting and legal services that cater to them. The financial services industry is Britain's most successful, contributing 6% of GDP and about 1/10 of tax revenue. The worst reaction to stock market stagnation would be for the government to throw up defensive barriers. It must resist the temptation to veto takeovers or block delistings. An open market lets some firms leave, but it also encourages others to come. Far better to tackle the deeper causes of the malaise. A starting point is Britain's corporate governance rules for listed firms. 20 years ago they were envied around the world, but they have since mushroomed and created a class of 3,000-odd semi-engaged and often semi-retired non-executive board directors who are rarely at the cutting edge of their global industry and often think their job is to sell firms, not to prod them to invest. This interest group is entrenched, but it has presided over poor results and needs to be culled. The imperative is less red tape and more directors who understand risk-taking, not virtue signalling. The stock market can also be made more attractive by letting dual-class shares join the LSE's premium segment. These give some shares souped-up voting rights and are popular among founders wishing to retain control. They are permitted by every one of the city's rivals, but Britain's befuddled legacy fund managers oppose them at home, even though they are willing to buy them abroad. Reform of the asset management industry is overdue. Actuarial rules create a perverse incentive for firms to hold debt and private assets, in which volatility is masked because they are valued infrequently. This bias should be removed. Britain's 5,327 corporate pension schemes should be merged into a few big managers with the scale to invest more competently. The good news is that a cohort of promising firms is emerging. In the past few years, venture capital has flooded into Britain, which has 34 privately held startups worth over $1 billion, and has created more such unicorns than France, Germany and Sweden combined. Companies like Revolut, a fintech star, are reaching critical mass. As well as deregulating corporate governance and allowing dual-class shares, the government should move ahead swiftly to make it easier for startups to hire talented foreigners and let graduates of leading universities move to Britain without a job offer. The prize is a new generation of innovative firms listing in London. Time for another big bang.
Leaders.
Xi Jinping's campaign. China's new reality. China's president will be defined by his campaign to tame capitalism.
Xi Jinping is waging a campaign to purge China of capitalist excesses. China's president sees surging debt as the poisonous fruit of financial speculation and billionaires as a mockery of Marxism. Businesses must heed state guidance. The party must permeate every area of national life. Whether Mr. Xi can impose his new reality will shape China's future, as well as the ideological battle between democracy and dictatorship. His campaign is remarkable for its scope and ambition. It started to rumble in 2020 when officials blocked the initial public offering of Ant Group, an affiliate of Alibaba, a tech giant. It is thundering onward, having so far destroyed perhaps $2 trillion of wealth. Didi, a ride-hailing outfit, has been punished for listing its shares in America. Evergrande, an indebted property developer, is being driven towards default. Trading on cryptocurrency exchanges has been banned as, more or less, has for-profit tutoring. Gaming is bad for children, so it must be strictly rationed. China needs larger families, so abortion must become rarer. Male role models should be manly and celebrities patriotic. Underpinning it all is Xi Jinping thought, which is being drummed into the craniums of 6-year-olds. This comes on top of an already brutal authoritarianism. As president, Mr. Xi has purged his rivals and locked up over 1 million Uyghurs. He polices debate and will not tolerate dissent. The latest campaign will show whether he is an ideologue bent on grabbing power for himself, even if growth slows and people suffer, or whether he is a strongman willing to temper dogma with pragmatism. His vision, in which party control ensures that business is aligned to the state and citizens dutifully serve the nation, will determine the fate of 1.4 billion people. Mr. Xi is tackling real problems. Indeed, many of them have parallels in the West. One is inequality. The slogan of the moment is common prosperity, reflecting how communist China remains as unequal as some capitalist countries. The top 20% of China's households take home over 45% of the country's disposable income. The top 1% own over 30% of household wealth. Another concern is the clout of tech giants accused of unfair competition, corrupting society and having unfettered access to personal data. Only the state has that privilege. A third is strategic vulnerability, particularly the threat that adversaries will obstruct access to commodities and vital technologies. Yet Mr. Xi's campaign poses a threat to China's economy. Pain from unravelling the debt of firms like Evergrande could spread unpredictably. Property developers are sitting on $2.8 trillion of borrowing. Property development and the industries that cater to it underpin about 30% of China's GDP. Households have parked their savings in real estate partly because other assets offer a poor return. Household spending on unfinished property accounts for half of developers' funding. Local governments, especially outside the big cities, depend on land sales and property development to generate revenue. The crackdowns are also making business harder and less rewarding. The party had been creating a regulatory and legal framework, but Mr. Xi is imposing big top-down changes so fast that regulation has started to seem arbitrary. Consider, for example, tertiary redistribution, in which shamed tech companies hand over cash to the state in an attempt to redeem themselves. Because conspicuous success is dangerous, private companies will be more cautious. State-owned firms and strategic industries, including hard tech, such as semiconductors, may benefit, but not the entrepreneurs who have been the true source of China's dynamism. One measure of anxiety is that foreigners who are not bottled in by capital controls pay 31% less than mainland investors for identical Chinese stocks. The gap has grown sharply since early 2020. All this threatens to punctuate China's economy. It was already facing a squeeze from declining returns to infrastructure investment and the effects of a shrinking workforce and growing numbers of aged dependents. After 40 years of breakneck expansion, most Chinese are completely unfamiliar with the hard choices that a sharp, sustained slowdown will impose. In politics, the danger is that Mr. Xi's campaign degenerates into a cult of personality. To bring about change, he has grabbed more power than any leader since Mao Zedong, as he prepares to break with protocol at the Communist Party's 20th Congress next year by claiming a third 5-year presidential term. He is using the campaign to organise a huge turnover in personnel as the basis for an ideological crackdown and as the reason why he should remain at the helm. Each of these contains dangers. One is that the bureaucracy fails him. Mr. Xi wants it to be responsive to market signals, but with promotions and purges in the air, China's officials are jumpy. One cause of the power cuts in 20 or so provinces in recent weeks was the panic of bureaucrats who suddenly realised that they were likely to miss their carbon reduction targets. Equally, however, officials fearful of being accused of corruption or ideological deviance by their rivals tend to sit on their hands. Failure is dangerous for a bureaucrat who takes the initiative, so is success. Another danger stems from the ideological crackdown. Moral review councils and moral clinics are enforcing orthodox behaviour using public shaming. Although there is as yet no prospect of anything as awful as the Cultural Revolution, Chinese people are becoming less free to think and talk. As well as promoting his own doctrines, Mr. Xi has played up red nostalgia and cast Maoism as a vital stage in building a new China, broadening his support before the party congress. Last come the politics of Mr. Xi himself. In the long run, if he clings to power, the succession could prove highly unstable. In the short run, if his attempt to impose a new reality does not go to plan, he will face a fateful choice to double down or step back. Up to this point, repression looks more likely than compromise. Western governments are also struggling with tech firms, inequality and national security. In America, Congress has risen to the occasion by contemplating a default on the national debt. Some may envy Mr. Xi's scope to get things done fast, but to imagine he has the right answers would be a big mistake.
Leaders.
Japanese politics. Uninspired. Japan deserves better than an inoffensive Prime Minister.
We avoided the worst-case scenario, ran one hashtag trending on Twitter after the election on September 29th, of Kishida Fumio as president of Japan's ruling party. For the right-wingers promoting the slogan, the worst case was Kono Taro, a popular and independent-minded minister who won the most votes in the first round of the election. They see him as too liberal to lead the inaptly named Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. But Japanese liberals were relieved too. For them, the worst case was Takaichi Sanae, a nationalist firebrand. The trait that propelled Mr. Kishida to victory appears to be his inoffensiveness. His victory was engineered by a party establishment that cherishes the status quo. He is unlikely to rock the boat, and just as unlikely to make waves. Indeed, the status quo is what precipitated the leadership election in the first place. After his predecessor, Abe Shinzo, stepped down last year because of ill health, Suga Yoshihide, the outgoing party president and prime minister, was seen by the party as a safe pair of hands. But his uninspiring handling of COVID-19, to say nothing of his lack of charm, turned the Japanese public against him. Confronted by the possibility of a humiliating loss of seats in lower house elections to be held in November, Mr. Suga resigned on September 3rd. His replacement is also a pair of supposedly safe hands, if a slightly younger one. With Mr. Kishida at the helm, the LDP may still suffer electorally, but the losses are likely to be smaller. The LDP considers that a victory. It is not. Japan has avoided some of the worst pathologies of rich democracies, such as populism and extreme partisanship. Yet the ruling party's persistent backroom deal-making bodes ill for democracy. Because the opposition is a shambles, the LDP is extremely unlikely to lose power in the coming elections. That makes its internal elections almost a substitute for national ones. But the process, which in the second round boils down to a few hundred LDP parliamentarians choosing along mostly factional lines, leaves the party's rank-and-file members, to say nothing of the voters, estranged from politics. Turnout in general elections has slipped from 69% in 2009 to less than 54% in 2017. The machinations that elevated Mr. Kishida will only deepen the public's disillusionment. Who leads Japan matters. It is a big country with 126 million people and the third largest economy in the world. It is a member of the G7 and the Quad, a security grouping formed as a counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific. It has championed free trade in America's absence and currently holds the chair of the CPTPP, a trade pact that both China and Taiwan have applied to join. Yet it will be hard for Japan to take a leadership role on the global stage without a strong prime minister. This week's vote also augurs badly for Japan's future. The country is stable, peaceful and prosperous, but it is aging even faster than other mature democracies. Its labour force is shrinking, its pension and healthcare costs are ballooning. A new leader needs bold ideas to deal with these ills, from boosting productivity to making the workplace more female-friendly. He also needs the charisma to sell such ideas to the public. He should be making hard choices to build on two of Mr. Suga's policies, overhauling the country's outdated bureaucracy and coming up with a realistic plan to achieve its target of net zero emissions by 2050. All this will take grit. Mr. Kishida, a compromise candidate amenable to the LDP's varied factions, has done little to suggest that he has it. Given the pace of demographic and social change, Japan cannot afford a government that simply muddles through. Perhaps Mr. Kishida will surprise his critics once he takes power. It seems more likely, though, that he will join a long list of unmemorable prime ministers. That is hardly the worst outcome of the election, but Japan can, and should, aim for something better.
Leaders.
Sex and language. She who must not be named. Why woman seems to be the hardest word.
Bodies with vaginas is an odd way to refer to half the human race, yet it was the quote that The Lancet, a medical journal, chose to feature on the cover of its latest issue, telling readers that, historically, the anatomy and physiology of such bodies had been neglected. After complaints about dehumanising language, The Lancet apologised. But it is not alone. A growing number of officials and organisations are finding themselves tongue-tied when it comes to using the word woman. A British hospital has instructed staff on its maternity wards to offer to use the phrase birthing people. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, a member of America's Congress, talks of menstruating people. On September 18th, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, republished a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a Supreme Court judge, on the anniversary of her death. The quote was a defense of a woman's right to have an abortion. But the ACLU's version, for which it too later apologised, replaced every instance of women with people. In Britain, the opposition Labour Party is tying itself in very public knots over questions such as whether only women possess cervixes. This linguistic shift is being driven by both compassion and fear. Compassion, because organisations are keen not to be seen to be excluding those whose sense of their gender does not match their sex, such as people who identify as trans or non-binary. And fear, because they are worried about attracting the wrath of online mobs should they be deemed to have violated a set of rapidly changing taboos about gender and sex that hardly existed 5 years ago and which, outside a few rarefied circles, still don't. Most dictionaries define a woman as an adult human female. Among some activists, this is a gross provocation, for they see it as denying that males can be women too. Language changes constantly. The word taboo, for instance, is an 18th century import from Polynesia. But doctors, bosses and politicians should think carefully before throwing away widely understood words or using them in new and radically different ways. In the rush to seem up-to-date, they risk doing a disservice to their own patients, employees and voters. One reason is that many of the new terms come across as dehumanising. As The Lancet discovered, many people, trans men as much as anyone else, dislike being described as collections of ambulatory body parts and secretions. More than a whiff of misogyny is in the air. It is striking that there is no comparably zealous campaign to abandon the word men in favour of prostate havers, ejaculators, or bodies with testicles. It is almost always women who are being ordered to dispense with a useful word they have used all their lives. Furthermore, understanding could suffer. Medical advice, for instance, has to be clear and intelligible by all. That is why Britain's National Health Service often prefers words like stomachache to dyspepsia, or heart attack to myocardial infarction. One survey conducted by a cervical cancer charity suggested that around 40% of women are unsure about the details of what exactly a cervix is. This implies that asking people with cervixes to turn up for screening appointments may not be clear or intelligible, especially to women who have English as their second language. Most broadly of all, the point of language is to communicate. Insisting on unfamiliar or alien-sounding terms will make it harder to discuss issues that affect only or disproportionately girls and women, such as female genital mutilation, domestic violence, child marriage, or the persistence of pay gaps. Many countries are debating whether safety or fairness should sometimes trump inclusion. Should male prisoners, even violent ones, who identify as women, be housed in women's prisons, as may happen in America, Britain, Canada and elsewhere? Should women's sports be reserved for biological females? Or should any athlete who identifies as a woman be allowed to join a women's rugby team? Cowed by the insults and viciousness such discussions provoke, many people are fearful of taking part. If harshly policed, baffling and alien-sounding language is added to the price of joining the debate, even fewer will be willing to elevate their cephalic protuberance above the parapet.
Leaders.
Taxes in America. Ways and means. America will never have a European-style welfare state without a VAT.
As governments spend more, it becomes increasingly important that they design their taxes carefully. Large European welfare states, such as Sweden or Germany, rely on growth-friendly value-added taxes, or VATs, to help raise the vast quantities of cash they dole out. America can get away with a tax system that is grossly inefficient and needlessly complex only because the amount of revenue it raises overall is relatively small. Small, but growing. Democrats in the House of Representatives are working out how to pay for President Joe Biden's proposed social spending bill, under which America would take a step in the direction of Europe with cash handouts for parents, childcare subsidies, green investment and more money for healthcare. The bill will probably be watered down in the Senate, but its present size is $3.5 trillion. That's 1.2% of projected GDP over the next decade. To help pay for it, lawmakers are proposing the biggest rise in taxes since 1993. The plan does little to move towards the efficient taxation that would be necessary were America ever to have the European-style welfare state to which many Democrats aspire. That is because the proposals have been crafted with the goal of raising taxes only on households with incomes in excess of $400,000. The left thinks the rich do not pay their fair share. They would like to raise the top rate of federal income tax from 37% to 39.6% and introduce a new 3% levy on earnings over $5 million. They also want to raise the rate of federal tax on corporate profits in excess of $5 million from 21% to 26.5%, glossing over the fact that wages will fall at least a bit as a result. The plan would raise the rate of capital gains tax and introduce various new levies. The federal government has some scope to raise more money from high earners, but the idea that the main problem with the existing system, that tax rates are too flat, is wrong. In 2018, the lowest fifth of earners, on average, paid no net federal taxes at all. The top 1% paid a total rate, i.e. after all deductions, of 30%, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Include state and local levies, and high earners face a marginal tax rate on each extra dollar they take home, the rate that matters for work incentives, which is middling by rich country standards. Tax refunds for poor families are exceptionally generous. In 2019, a single parent of 2 children earning 2/3 of average pay faced total net labour taxes of only 10%, according to analysis by the OECD, a club of mostly rich countries. In egalitarian Sweden, the rate was nearly 33%. Inefficiency is a bigger problem in America than the failure of rates to be sufficiently progressive. Myriad deductions allow the very rich to disguise labour income as lightly taxed capital income. And unwillingness to levy a VAT, which is a tax on consumption, means America relies on taxes that deter work and investment. America is one of only 3 rich countries to collect more than 70% of its tax revenue from labour income and corporate profits. Sales taxes, levied by states and localities, are the only significant taxes on consumption. The plan does far too little to boost efficiency. On the upside, it would curtail the carried interest loophole, which lets investment managers class their fees as capital gains, not income. It would reduce tax evasion by increasing enforcement, such as through audits of the tax returns of high earners, which more than pays for itself, and it would try to get more money from pass-through companies, shells which let many professionals treat their income as business profits, incurring a lower tax rate. Yet much is wrong with the Democrats' plans. They appear to have foregone closing one of the most costly loopholes, which writes off capital gains when assets are inherited. The rise in corporation tax would take the total rate, including average state and local levies, to 31%, the 3rd highest among rich countries. In the House, they seem uninterested in a carbon tax to combat climate change. And although it is not yet in the plan, they are talking about lifting the cap on an exemption from federally taxable income of money used to pay state and local taxes. The cap was introduced in 2017 under Donald Trump. Lifting it would further subsidize high-tax states and almost exclusively benefit the rich. Democrats would be raising top income tax rates while narrowing the tax base, the opposite of good tax policy. America's economy would survive these proposals, but its creaky and cumbersome tax code should not be asked to support the size of government that many Democrats want in the long term, which includes, say, government-funded universal health care. Republicans know this is implausible. They typically oppose VAT because they see it as too convenient a source of funds. Democrats dislike the tax because it is mildly regressive. But there is a reason VATs underpin European-style welfare states. There is no desirable alternative.
Leaders.
The future of food. Working up an appetite. Consumers and governments should embrace new ways to make food.
What's for dinner? The answer matters at every level. Food connects the personal to the planetary. Agriculture uses half the world's habitable land and accounts for more than 30% of global emissions. Food production links the great biogeochemical cycles of carbon and nitrogen, both on a planetary level, and also in specific factories that combine natural gas with nitrogen and oxygen from the air to produce agricultural fertilizer on the one hand and carbon dioxide for use in food processing on the other. When one such factory in Teesside in northern England recently threatened to shut down because of high natural gas prices, the government had to step in to prevent food supply chains from collapsing. Globally, food prices have risen in 13 of the past 15 months and are close to their peak of 2011 owing to poor weather, pandemic-related disruption and fallout from a swine flu outbreak in China in 2018. In the longer term, the food system faces pressure from climate change, population growth, and a shift towards more westernized, meat-heavy diets. Fortunately, technologies are emerging that promise to produce food in new ways, in large volumes, with less inhumane factory farming and a lower environmental footprint. These range from bioreactors that grow meat to indoor vertical farms and new ways of producing fish. Such techniques could make a huge difference. 3/4 of agricultural land is used for livestock, for example, so it is easy to see how steaks made from plant-based protein or grown in vats from cells could greatly reduce factory farming and land and water use and produce fewer emissions. Just because it is possible to make food in new ways does not mean people will be willing to eat it, however. Given food's cultural importance and the fact that it is ingested into the body, conservatism and scepticism are common reactions to new foodstuffs and production processes. In 17th century Europe, many people were loath to eat a new vegetable called the potato, because it was not mentioned in the Bible, or because they feared it caused leprosy. Today, many European countries ban the cultivation and sale of genetically modified crops, even though they are widely grown and eaten elsewhere. And although much of the world considers insects a mouth-watering treat, and locust eating is endorsed in the Bible, the very idea revolts many Western consumers. At the same time as novel foods are shunned, traditional foods and farming law are venerated. In California, the fanciest restaurants aspire to recreate the humble diet of the Tuscan peasant. Many Western consumers are willing to pay extra for food produced by organic farming, in effect a historical reenactment of pre-20th century agriculture, because it avoids chemicals. Everything is made of chemicals. Yet supposedly timeless food traditions are often shallower than they seem. In the Columbian Exchange, in the 16th century, food crops from the Americas rapidly spread around the world. Tomatoes and polenta, staples of the Italian diet, are American in origin and were unknown to the Romans or to Dante. Potatoes were eventually widely adopted in Europe. The invention of French fries helped. It is hard to imagine many Asian cuisines without chili peppers, but they too are American. Coffee from Arabia and tea from China were unknown in Europe before the 17th century. The new foods and processes on offer today present opportunities to create delicious and sustainable new traditions. Western consumers should put aside their reservations about eating crickets and give plant-based burgers, 3D printed steaks, and vat-grown artificial tuna a try. Regulators, especially in Europe and America, should streamline their processes for approving cultured meat, be more open to gene-editing crops, as Britain said it would be this week, and speed up approval of edible insects for animal feed and human consumption. A wholesale reimagining of the food system is needed, but that will be possible only if both consumers and regulators are prepared to be more daring about what to eat for dinner.